scandal that is currently swirling around Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. You know Justin Trudeau, this brilliant defender of gender equality.
So that's why we came here today to ask you to also look into the policies that religious charitable organizations have in our legislation so that it can also be changed, because maternal love is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to look into
we would like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind.
With that kind of leadership, what could possibly go wrong in Canada? Now in this video, I'd like to cover some background around this particular controversy, read a news article around SNC Lavalin and what Trudeau is accused of. I'd like to evaluate the justifications that the Prime Minister and his office are putting together to try to explain why he did what he did. And then I want to see if we can arrive at a conclusion as to whether or not his actions are justified. Now first I'm going to provide some background to the controversy. And this is a news article taken from Bloomberg News, and it's written by a reporter named David Scanlon. And here's what it says. SNC was hardly a household name before Trudeau's crisis began about a month ago on reports that his former Attorney General, Judy Wilson-Raybould, felt she was unduly pressured by Trudeau's office to help the company avoid a trial on corruption charges. This company has global contracts in far-flung places and have created many problems for SNC and now for Trudeau. The company was charged by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 2015 for allegedly paying bribes more than a decade earlier to Muammar Gaddafi's regime in Libya. Closer to home, the company paid restitution to several Quebec municipalities under a provincial program to recoup overcharges in tainted public contracts. While La Presse has reported it could face charges over a bribery scheme tied to the renovation of a Montreal bridge. A lot going on with this company, not something Trudeau probably should be touching. Canada's public prosecutor rejected SNC's request for an out-of-court settlement in September. Wilson-Raybould could have stepped in order to overturn the order, but chose not to. Trudeau's team urged her to reconsider, sparking the current scandal. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development said Monday it has written to Trudeau's government outlining its concerns about potential political interference in the case. So why is SNC so special that it warrants all this political capital? Jobs, for one. Lots of them. SNC employs more than 52,000 people around the world and is one of the few global giants still based in Canada. Almost 9,000 SNC workers are in Canada, with about a third of those in the largely French-speaking province of Quebec. These kind of job numbers and highly skilled, well-paid workers are tempting for any politician to protect. So that's the news article. So ultimately the story boils down to a major corporation lobbying Prime Minister Trudeau to get themselves out of a criminal prosecution. And Canada's top lawyer, the Attorney General, refused to grant that company a reprieve from that criminal charge. And the Attorney General has testified before a committee that she was repeatedly pressured and even threatened by the Prime Minister's office and other representatives from his office to reconsider her opinion on the case. And so if the Attorney General's allegations are true, then the actions of the Prime Minister and his office could constitute political interference in a criminal case, which potentially could amount to obstruction of justice. And if obstruction of justice is proven, the Prime Minister and his lackeys could potentially face criminal charges themselves. So the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party have been defending his actions by saying that he was trying to save 9,000 jobs. Jobs that are filled by highly skilled and highly paid workers, and many within Quebec, Trudeau's home province, and headquartered in Montreal, which just happens to be the city where Trudeau's political riding is located. Now my interest in covering this topic is because it raises the classical ethical question of, do the ends justify the means? And I'm especially interested in exploring the answer to that question as a Bible-believing Christian. So let me first establish what it means by the ends justifying the means. So the ends justifying the means stems from an ethical theory called consequentialism. And the ethical theory of consequentialism claims that the moral rightness of an action is determined by its consequences. So therefore, in deciding what we should do in any given situation, morally speaking, we should carefully take into account the expected results of our actions, and if our actions produce what people desire, need, or what makes them happy, then that's the action we should perform. And there are two primary forms of consequentialism. There's utilitarianism that holds that the most moral or ethical action is the one that brings about the greatest good for the greatest number. Then there's hedonism, which is the rightness of an action depends on whether or not it brings about ultimate happiness or limits pain. So those are the two forms of consequentialism. Now the antithesis of consequentialism is deontological ethics, which claims that the morality of an action is based on whether the action itself is considered right or wrong under a given set of moral rules. So the morality of the action is not dependent on the consequences, it's dependent on whether the action itself is moral. Now if we were to look at the actions of Prime Minister Trudeau, was he operating according to consequentialism or deontological ethics? Well, based on definition, he was acting on the basis of consequentialism. Whether that was a conscious intent or not, that's how it framed itself. So there's two reasons why I would say that. One, he acted unethically, potentially criminally, by interfering in the justice system. And then, this is really what kind of defines it as consequentialism, he then tried to justify his actions on the basis of the outcome or the consequence of his actions, in this case, saving 9,000 Canadian jobs. Now, Trudeau is not the only politician to take a consequentialist approach to seek certain ends or results that they believe are necessary to achieve. In fact, it's an approach that's probably taken far too often in politics. And it doesn't always take the degree of obstruction of justice like Prime Minister Trudeau may be charged with. Sometimes it's as simple as a politician telling a lie, a half-truth, or exaggerating the truth in order to convince the general populace of the importance or moral good of the desired end, and also to convince members of the legislatures to support the desired ends with votes. Now, a politician that used this quite often was Barack Obama. So I'll show you an example of how he used consequentialism, in the telling of lies, half-truths, and exaggerations, in order to sell the American public and U.S. legislators that the Obamacare plan was not only necessary for America, but was the right thing morally. You may remember this.
If you misrepresent what's in this plan, we will call you out. We'll be able to keep your health care plan. If you like your doctor, you will be able to keep your doctor, period. I will not sign it if it adds one dime to the deficit, now or in the future, period. We'll work to lower your premiums by up to $2,500 per family per year. That will not happen on my watch. I will protect Medicare.
What I've proposed to do is to make sure that we've got a plan that covers all Americans.
This law means more choice, more competition, lower costs for millions of Americans.
Now, for President Obama, the most important thing was the outcome or the ends. Obamacare would be his legacy, and he wanted it to pass. So lies, exaggerations, half-truths were merely the necessary actions to deliver to the American people a plan that he may have believed was for the greater good. To him, the value of Obamacare was an outcome, would allow people to forget the less than truthful ways in which the plan was sold to Congress and ultimately to the American people. Truths and facts are starting to become old-fashioned as a concept in politics. What matters is the perceived morality of the ends. Let's listen to this brilliant Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, explain this.
One of the criticisms of you is that your math is fuzzy. The Washington Post recently awarded you 4 Pinocchios.
Oh my goodness.
For misstating some statistics about Pentagon spending.
If people want to really blow up one figure here or one word there, I would argue that they're missing the forest for the trees. I think that there's a lot of people more concerned about being precisely, factually, and semantically correct than about being morally right.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I love to stick a clue into her head and then watch the two of them dance around together. I mean, that's kind of mean, but how do I put this? I wish she was just smart enough to realize how dumb she is. Maybe that would keep her quiet. Now, as Christians, what can we say about consequentialism? Is the moral rightness of an action determined by its consequences? Is an action to be forgiven if the end result is considered morally correct or valuable? I think without further analysis, my answer as a Christian is of course not. Immoral or unethical actions should never be taken. There is no excuse for bad behavior, even if there is a good outcome. But I'd like to go a little bit deeper into this. And I want to ask the question, why is consequentialism, or the idea that the ends justify the means, wrong from a biblical standpoint? And I think the answer ultimately lies in understanding man's responsibility before God. We are moral agents, we're made in the image of God, and we have the capacity to know right from wrong. And that moral capacity then gives us the ability to govern our behaviors or our actions. And because we're able to control the way in which we conduct ourselves before other human beings and ultimately before God, then we are responsible for the morality of our actions. In Proverbs 20 verse 11 it says, "Even a child is known by his doings, whether his work be pure and whether it be right." And then James 4:17 says, "Therefore to one who knows the right thing to do and does it not, to him it is sin." It is our actions by which we are judged, so we should always act morally, irrespective of the anticipated end. Now, even if the moral rightness of a consequence did provide a redemptive value to the actions taken, there's no guarantee that the consequence or the end we are striving for will even come to pass. Now, suppose you are willing to commit an immoral act because the desired end is of incomparable moral value, and then suppose the end doesn't materialize. Now, you are left accountable for committing an immoral act, and the end you were going for doesn't even come to pass. My point is this: we can control our actions and are responsible for them, but we ultimately have no control over the ends that may or may not materialize. The ends belong to God because He alone knows the future. In Proverbs 19:21 it says, "Many plans are in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord will stand." So we can intend for our actions to lead to a certain end. We can have many plans, but in the end it's God's counsel or His will that will stand. Isaiah 46:9 and 10, "Remember the former things long past, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, saying my purpose will be established and I will accomplish all my good pleasure." In the end, it's God's purposes that will be accomplished despite our actions and despite the desired outcomes that we have in mind. Remember the story of Joseph? Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery and then faked his death in order to deceive their father. And then years later, after a bunch of roller coaster rides of good things and bad things, Joseph eventually ends up as second leader in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh in power. And he was used of God to save the known world from starvation during a huge famine that happened. Now, Joseph's brothers, later on, could they point to his wealth, stature, and the great blessings he brought upon the known earth and say, look, if we hadn't sold him into Egypt, then none of these great things would have been accomplished? No, they couldn't justify their actions based on that. And in fact, Joseph speaks to that very thing in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, when he says to his brothers, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." They were responsible for their evil actions. It was God that took those evil actions and brought about the good ends. They didn't control the ends, they controlled their actions and were responsible for it. So now let's go back to Prime Minister Trudeau and SNC Lavalin. Trudeau should not get a pass on his alleged unethical and perhaps criminal behavior because he was trying to accomplish the noble ends of saving 9,000 Canadian jobs. In reality, he has no control over what the company SNC Lavalin might do in the future. In fact, further on in the news article that I read earlier, the reporter wrote this: "The risk of a massive jobs flight may be a stretch. Even the worst case scenario, in which SNC is convicted and faces a 10-year government ban in Canada, would hardly be crippling. Canada accounts for less than 30% of the company's revenue, and the government work is only a fraction of that. What's more, SNC committed to keeping its head office in Montreal under terms of a loan from a Quebec pension fund in the Atkins deal. So truth be told, it was likely that Trudeau was more concerned with the impact on his re-election bid in 2019 than he was in saving 9,000 Canadian jobs. The ends do not justify the means. We need to be responsible in the here and now for what we do, and we let God worry about the ends.